in terms of situating this project, this also comes out of a presentation from 4 years ago that, as a triple-authored paper, Ethan Lieb and Andrew Kent came to this conference and presented Faithful Execution in Article 2. And they came to this conference. I presented it at the Arizona conference. This is another advantage of having multi-authored, is to share that, to share those perks and boondoggles. But one of the things that I experienced was, on vacation with my family, getting a series of texts from Ethan and Andrew about all of the things that they benefited from and all of the sources. And so this project comes out of that paper. And so I want to also just, explicitly thank Andrew and Ethan as being faithful writing partners and thought partners in this project, which is building up to a book that is currently, I think the working title is A Faithful President, the Founders versus the Originalists. And part of this is the question of the unitary executive theory. So first of all, the first project that was Faithful Execution in Article 2, where the point was that the Take Care Clause also should be understood as the Faithful Execution Clause, the Oath of Faithful Execution, and that those clauses are about imposing a duty, and the claim that those clauses create an indefeasible power would be a duty creating not a correlative power that would be the same, but creating a power would be the incongruity of creating a power greater than the duty. So faithful execution was one step here. I also wrote an article about the creation of the Department of Justice about 10 years ago, and about the history of prosecution, which engaged with Scalia's dissent in Morrison versus Olson in part, and about the rise of, about the independence of prosecutors as a matter of 18th and 19th century history. Then I've got a piece coming out in a month called The Indecisions of 1789, and in digging into those sources and into those debates, if anything, the decision of 1789 was a rejection of the idea of indefeasible, indefeasible or not, the idea that Article 2 conveyed a removal power. Then there's a piece called Vesting about what the actual, the dictionary use of the word vesting, and that there's an assumption that, reading backward from the vested rights doctrine, that was a Marshall Court invention, that the word vested rights and legislative indefeasibility was what the reference was in the 18th century, and that is a projection back. That was not what vested meant. And then there's this project. So I think as I've talked to various people and engaged, and I've frankly, and I learned so much from so many people in this room, the part of this project comes out of conversations I've had with interlocutors who basically say, look, all that might be true, but executive power implied removal. And as long as that's true, that's the pillar that we're going to rest on. So this paper, I stumbled onto this project, this particular set of sources, by listening to a podcast, and that was the Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast. And so season 4 is on the French Revolution, and I was listening to that episode, and he starts talking about the venalité in the French as one of the causes of the French Revolution, and a light bulb went off of just being an AP Euro 30 years ago, and remembering, right, this was part of the ancient regime. And then I just went back and Googled venalité, and there Montesquieu popped up, and I just dug back into that source, and it is a remarkable explanation that removal is a mark of a despotic government, and it is monarchies, and as Montesquieu thinks about monarchies, we're talking about legal, constitutional monarchies, or monarchies of legality, that as opposed to removal, there's venalité and offices as property. And so it turns out that that source on the founders' bookshelves lines up with what else was on their bookshelves, and made sense of other material that I had been using in other pieces. Another article about, I call it removal of context, about the importance of the context of Blackstone and other writers, and I just hadn't seen this piece of it. And part of why it's, I think, significant is that and I'll give Ilan credit here. I mean, there have been a number of other historians and work that I've done, which I think Ilan's critique in his article, In Search of Prerogative, is fair. The critique that Ilan has, I think it's note 204, is that right? Not that I've spent much time. So he points out about one of these projects that the finding examples of offices that were held as property was some mix of just too anecdotal. So I think, some of what Ilan says about those examples, I think you focused on that they were too old. I mean, some of them were 15th and 16th century. Some of them were too quasi-judicial, so too close to the judicial function, or too low to be considered having significant executive power. And look, I'll be honest, I had some of those concerns, but Ilan is the first one to have put those questions in writing. And I also would add to those concerns about some of those examples is that some of them were too recent. Examples in one of those papers focuses on the rise of independent commissions in the mid-1780s. And I think that's clearly too late in English practice, but that also raises the broader question, which is these details of English law were too remote to be particularly illuminating or probative of anecdotal or isolated or examples of English practice when the question is American original public meaning. And so the stumbling on venality then led me to find that instead of this being incidental or anecdotal, the venality system was a pervasive and systematic foundation for the modern administrative state from the 14th, 15th century to the rise of empires. And it was a fun, and as I read, there are a lot of historians who've written about the two models of how the modern state was built in terms of the administrative state. One model was the patronage model, where there was removal at will, removal at pleasure, and the other model was the venality model, which was premised on office as property. And this is a project in conversation with Nick Perillo's fantastic book, Against the Profit Motive. His book shows that on the one end was the profit motive. This is the other half of the story, which is in exchange for getting access to the profits of fees and bounties, the central administration used the sale of office as a signal and an investment with lining up incentives and disincentives. Incentives for faithful execution, faithful performance with oaths and the loss. So it was a system that, to our ears, sounds corrupt, but to their world system prior to the communication and transportation revolution, it was a rational system of incentives. And it reminds me, Jack invoked earlier yesterday, said the past is a foreign country. In this case, it's literally true. I mean, we're talking about foreign countries, and there is the question that Mike Ramsey indicated in the last session, which is when is European or when is English practice a model or an anti-model? I think that's also the Taylor Swift question, like a hero or anti-hero, right? But I think that what this project is, I'd like to think it's consistent with what Julian's project is, which is a surprising way that the world used to work, and it is helpful to think about our own world. And just like Nick Perillo's work is disorienting and reorienting, I found this just to be a surprising way that the administrative state worked in many ways opposite to our own. So one of the historians that I'm citing here is Aylmer, one of the experts on English administration, and he has a sentence that is the reverse of our assumptions now, which is that in the English system, many executive officers had more job security and had offices as freehold property that were more secure than judges. And that is the system that was the background and the pervasive system that the Americans had in the background, which solves some mysteries. And so some of those, the background here is that I was puzzled by the lack of sourcing by the presidential arguments, and I think part of the concern is why is it that there are so few arguments about the removal power? Was it that there was an assumption that the removal was obvious? And I think what I'm trying to show here is, in fact, I think it was the opposite. I think it was obvious that removal was not the executive power, which is why there was silence in the Anti-Federalist Papers in storing 6 volumes. And as Jonathan Ganapp and I are both showing, that it just was not even among the, the people who are most incentivized to raise these concerns. Anti-Federalists never, we cannot find a single example where the concern that they would raise, that makes sense that they would raise, is that among the risks of the Constitution was that it was creating a presidency with these kinds of powers. If this, I think, is in Scalia's or other kinds of interpretive moves, this is a dog that just didn't bark.